Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar this afternoon. Jen, do you want to go ahead and pull up the slides? All right, well, while she gets that set up, for those of you who don't know me, Melissa Savage with the Center for Environmental Excellence at ASHO. And again, thank you for joining us this afternoon for our virtual peer exchange on alternative project delivery in the NEPA process. Jen, you can go to the next slide. So before we get into the meat of the presentations, I wanted to just give you an update on the center. For those of you not familiar, we are in cooperation with the Federal Highway Administration, and it is through ASHO. Our overall goal is to promote environmental stewardship and encourage innovative ways to streamlining project delivery. We have all kinds of resources on our website, including case studies, webinar recordings, and practitioner handbooks. And by the way, we are recording this session. It will be posted on the center's website in the coming weeks. So let me run through the agenda for today's virtual peer exchange. So we will have federal highways on soon. I believe that they'll go at the end of the state presentations, but today we're joined by Pennsylvania, Minnesota, and Utah. They graciously provided time over the last several months in preparing 3 case studies that we will also post to the center website. And this virtual peer exchange is meant to kind of give an overview of what will be more detail provided in the case studies, again, that we will post on our center's website in the near future. So without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Gary Kleist with PennDOT. He's a project manager and section chief, and then he will pass the ball to Mark Lombard, the section chief and environmental staff at PennDOT.
Melissa, just so you know, I'm filling in for Neil today.
Oh, James, would you like to go?
I absolutely can.
Okay, great. So we'll have you go, and then Gary can speak once you're finished. Sorry, I didn't see you there, but I'm glad you're on.
Not a problem at all. I appreciate it. I'm pinch hitting today. I don't want that to be a reflection of the fact that you get me instead of Mr. Neil Vanikar is not a reflection of FHWA's wavering commitment to this ideal. I think, you know, as Melissa suggested, a lot of this work is heavily supported by FHWA. I am James Gavin. I'm team lead for project and policy development to the Office of Project Development and Environmental Review at headquarters FHWA. And I think that FHWA has been a supporter of alternative delivery mechanisms since they came into being. We have a great deal of support for the flexibilities that this provides, that the type of alternative delivery mechanisms that we'll be hearing about today are not appropriate for all projects, but they do provide flexibilities. There are times when these type of techniques are certainly appropriate, and we have a great deal of support for that. We've also worked with our federal partners across the other agencies and other departments of the federal government to explain a lot of the things that go into project delivery, a lot of the things that go into the alternative mechanisms, and try to put their minds at ease and let them know, you know, what is available to us, what we can do that may make sure that their equities aren't foreclosed upon and that we can be good partners, and to make sure they understand that our embrace of these type of mechanisms is not in any way a means to shortchange or somehow bypass environmental stewardship and a proper environmental review of these type of projects, that this is merely techniques that are appropriate for certain projects and allow certainly a lot of aspects of funding to get taken care of that might not otherwise. FHWA has a number of different resources available for those who want to learn more. about some of these techniques. There's the FHWA Federal Construction Program Guide. There's the Preliminary Engineering Guidance. Both of those documents are readily available on FHWA's website. And we also would point to our opportunity, our availability to take advantage of these things. And we have Q&As on design build and NEPA as referenced to 23 CFR 636.109, talking about how the NEPA process relates to the design build procurement process. Of course, design build being only one of the type of mechanisms that can be used at alternative delivery. But I think as we start to see more embrace of alternative delivery, certainly in the current funding dilemma that many of the states find themselves in, and probably that is, until we find a different mechanism other than the Highway Trust Fund to fund a lot of these projects, will be in that difficult funding situation. And these type of procurement processes that go into alternative project delivery do provide us a lot of flexibility, a lot of means to deliver projects that we wouldn't otherwise. And at the end of the day, we are FHWA and our state DOT partners. We are project delivery folks. That's what we do. And these type of techniques go a long way to allowing us to fulfill our mission. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, James. I'm glad you could join us. So one thing I neglected to say is as we proceed with our speakers, please feel free at any time to put questions that you might have or comments in the chat. We do have time at the end after all of the states have presented to do a Q&A. So please, again, feel free to enter any questions that you might have in our chat. And with that, Gary from Pennsylvania DOT, I will turn it over to you. And I think Jen has your slides that she will pull up.
Great. There we go. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. Let me move next couple slides. There we go. I'm going to first talk about our rapid bridge replacement project, which was a P3 procurement project. And then we're going to talk in regard to some of the comparisons of the alternative delivery, basically P3 and design build. For the RBR project, it was, like I said, a P3 project that replaced 558 poor condition bridges throughout the state of Pennsylvania. It was a project in which the development entity designed, built, maintained, and financed this project, and they have a term of 25 years to maintain the bridges. One of the primary benefits of this P3 alternative delivery type of model was the department was, the Commonwealth was able to replace these 558 poor condition bridges, and we did it in complement of our normal program. So we were able to continue on with our normal program, plus addressing a great need within the Commonwealth of a lot of poor condition bridges, in which we have. Next slide, please. Okay, we did have to get a SEP 15 approval for this project, because we did have the development entity do the NEPA documents on that, and Mark will probably touch on that a little bit more. But this was kind of innovative, and it was without this, we really couldn't deliver this project on time that we had promised. Next slide, please. Okay. Throughout the project, we after the project was done, we worked with the development entity hand in hand, and we developed a lessons learned that we were trying to, you know, throughout the project, so we can learn how to do things. And the four things that we did come up with is the as someone alluded to before, is whenever you use an alternative delivery, you have to use it on the right project, right assets and things of that nature. It's not a one size fits all. So it really is, the project selection is very key for that. You have to also, you know, set the next two things there, set the rules of engagement, and, you know, make sure that everyone understands what each one's have and what responsibilities have up front. It's very important to do that up front in regard to that, so therefore you can work collaboratively in regard to these projects. And the last one is that I have shown there is, you know, take your time in regarding to doing the upfront work of establishing these rules of engagements. A lot of people, you want to rush into these projects right off the bat, and you know get your boots to the ground, but then you run into situations that you have to, you know, work through them, and it's best to just, you know, take a little bit of time up front and get your means and methods, your systems all worked out first, and things will typically end up being a little bit more smoother. Next slide, please. Okay, the P3 RBR programs, you did experience significant time savings, and we believe it was largely contributable to the P3 methods. PennDOT believes that it would have taken several more years in order to complete what we had to do here in regards to these 558 bridges. Just for the sheer fact that some of these bridges weren't even on our financing, and they weren't on our procurement tip for 10 years. So we were able to move them up rather quickly. And in addition to that, you know, we think that, you know, probably the bulk of the savings in time was the ability to put everything into one procurement and one process, therefore saving all that contract time, expediting all those procurement time. That would seem to be a huge savings in regard to that. Now, PennDOT has experienced time savings using design build over design bid build. And I'd say that the biggest time savings that we have experienced in regarding to that is obviously that overlap between the design and construction that project. But one thing I'd like to caution is the design bid build, you know, that has heavily influenced in regards to the amount of right-of-way acquisition and utilities and railroad involvements that you have there. So coming back to that selection of the project, in order to be very successful on that, you have to really pick the right project for these things. Next slide, please. The RBR project, PennDOT was in regards to change orders. We did have a lot of the what we're calling here owner-directed change orders, in which we knew going into the game we would have to process change orders for. One of the things, for example, that we took on, a couple of things were like utilities relocation. We paid for the utilities relocation and any environmental hazards that unforeseen was out there. We knew this going into the game, we'd have to write those type of change orders. But outside of those type of things, we did find that, you know, we had very few other changes compared to a typical design bid build project. So that was I'd say a very good, useful, and successful thing in regard to that. In addition to that, you know, on your typical design build project, your number of claims, we have found that it's a little bit lower than your typical design bid build nature type of project. But as you can see by the last checkpoint of the bullet there is coming back to the right of way and utilities in regard to that. Sometimes no matter how good you do your job in regard to that, if you have bad right of way acquisitions and some of your utilities can go bad, that can turn sour real quick. All righty, next slide, please. All right, and this, so the last slide we have here regarding to the comparisons of the P3 comparing to design build and design bid build. The P3, we did get, it depends upon your type of project and what type of innovation you're going to get if it allows for that. But we have found that the P3 project, along with the design build project, will give you a lot more innovations in regard to it. Gives them a little more flexibility in regarding to as opposed to design bid build. And we found that the two alternative deliveries of P3 and also design build, you're going to have a lot less of a scope creep in regard to that as you would during the design bid build. So that's a quick comparisons in regards to our experiences using alternative deliveries. I'd like to next turn it over to Mark to talk about the NEPA experiences we've had and the environmental. Excuse me.
Thank you, Gary. Can you hear me, Gary?
We can. Thank you.
Okay. One thing Gary had mentioned, and my name is Mark Lombard, and I took care of the environmental process and that SEP 15 process for Gary for this project. I can't stress enough either of what Gary said is that you got to take your time going into one of these. It was a massive project. I mean, an $889 million contract. There's a lot of loopholes to be found in that. But anyway, the EDA, the Early Development Agreement, was signed in 2014. And in that was a SEP 15, which is Special Experimental Project, that was an agreement with Federal Highways that allowed us to allow we call them the development entity, the people that bought the contract to change the bridges, to allow them to do the environmental process to help streamline it and see if this process would work. Next, please. Okay, basically, we wanted to see if there was a noticeable difference between design build and design bid build, and we did see some differences, and we'll go into that in a few minutes here. Jen, next slide, please. Okay, we entered in it was an agreement with PennDOT and Federal Highways for SEP 15, Special Experimental Project. It was basically, like I stated, to let the designers, the people that bought the bridges to replace them, allow them to do the NEPA process. Next, Jen. So we're basically, this was looking at new approaches for project delivery. Federal Highways and us, as James has said, we were looking for a quicker way to deliver projects without impairing Federal Highways' responsibility to the taxpayers and to the environment. It allowed us to transfer the preliminary engineering to the DE for environmental clearance and all the related permits. The DE had local firms doing their NEPA process, but they were still paid by the contractor. So take that for what it's worth. They were doing the right thing, but they had a lot of roadblocks along the way for the NEPA clearance, at least in the beginning. Next, Jen. Basically, this was to deviate from 23 CFR, and I'm not going to go into it, the numbers, because I'll just get them all jumbled up anyways. But basically is what that says in 23 CFR. It's 636 is the start. but this prohibits the contractor from doing their own NEPA. And this process was to see how it would work out if they do allow that or do change 23 CFR to allow that. Basically, they're looking at ways to save time and money for infrastructure projects. That last bullet point on there is very important. We did retain exclusive control over the consultants who prepare the NEPA documents, but we also had the final approval. The DOT, PennDOT in this case, had to sign off on all the NEPA documents. All right, next, Jen. When we did this experiment to see how well this was going to work out and look at time and money, we compared it to a baseline, and our baseline was out of the 558 bridges. I think there were 78 very similar bridges that we measured the time and cost to do those. So that was what we were comparing the rest to. So we got, in essence, we got the contractor a jump start by getting the NEPA clearance, and it doesn't really matter, but I think it was like 60 or 70 bridges. And then that's what we compared our numbers to at the end. They estimated about $1.2 million to do the NEPA in savings for design bid build projects. The time saving was about 2.5 months. It's kind of negligible on the overall length of projects, but that came into the procurement process, and that's where the time was saved. Next, Jen. The lessons learned that we kind of pointed out here is make sure the consultant is familiar with the environmental manuals and policies. And since most of the consultants were our local consultants anyways, they were pretty familiar with them. But I can tell you, the contractor, the development entity, questions a lot of the stuff that needs to be done in NEPA because they're contractors. They have no idea what it takes to go into the preliminary engineering and get that project through the NEPA process into design. Ensure the subject leads or key personnel are what they say they are. I would take a real hard look at them, because when you have the lead for the environmental on the development entity side asking what 4F is, that is not a good sign. So take a good hard look at and try to get some expectation that they're going to stay with the project throughout, which we can't really do, but it would be a very nice to have that in writing somehow, but we're probably never going to get that. And also ensure the environmental is a collaborative process to minimize redesign and reevaluation. It happened over and over and over. It wasn't the end of the world, but it takes time. Next, Jen. Public involvement was a very rocky start. Most of the, all of the project, all 558 bridges were CE. So when you hear a CE, you think, well, there's not a whole lot of controversy. That's why it's a CE. But they didn't fully understand, and I guess it's partly our fault too, about the importance of public involvement. Not so much on your routine projects, but ones that involve detours. That's where you really got to reach out to the public. They didn't do that at first. We ended up writing a new public involvement policy for them and made them follow it. The projects involving more complex NEPA documentation, they put those off to the end. Ones that involved 6F issues, 106 issues, 4F issues, they slid those to the side. And then when the project came to an end and they didn't get their clearances right away, that presented a little bit of a problem to them. We did work through it, but that's something you really should look out for, is make sure that if another state gets involved in this, to don't let them put off the easy work or the difficult work until the end. We also ensured that the DOT and FHWA maintain the review approvals and authority through NEPA documentation. Federal Highways really didn't have too much approval authority other than on a couple 4F documents that required our division's signature. Next, Jen. Also, when we got behind the timelines for back and forth in the NEPA. So they'd send in a NEPA, we'd have it checked. I would find things wrong, or my consultants, they'd have to go back and fix it. So make sure there's a time frame in there, like you have 5 days to review it. You get it back to us, we'll have 5 days to get it back. If not, it'll go back and forth forever. So you really got to make sure that the contractor and your DOT has committed timeframes in there. And you got to maintain early and constant coordination with the outside agencies. And that's easy for us to do as a DOT, but the development entity, he doesn't have those relationships with those outside agencies. So we had a lot more involvement than what I anticipated we were going to have in the first place. Make sure the environmental consultant is involved throughout the design and permitting. More actively involved the DOT and environmental mitigation discussions with the regulatory agencies. That's important. The regulatory agencies aren't going to take the phone calls from every contractor that's out there. They'll say work through your DOT for the most part. And conduct early performance monitoring, the NEPA documentation and the Section 106 process. In the beginning, it was very easy. Oh yeah, everything's going along smooth. Well, once all those documents start coming in for approval, not so much the case. Next slide, Jen. These are a couple of the products that came out of our lessons learned. We developed a streamlined aquatic resources report instead of our typical ones that can take months and months. We got together with our local water resource agency, came with a report, checklist, basically slap a few pictures in there, and it was done. We've developed a streamlined section with the 106 with our SHPO, which expedited the 106 process, which we all know can take forever. And also in conjunction with FHWA, we made a 4F template that made it much easier for them to get through the 4F process. These special 4F and the 106 stuff, they were only a few projects. We tried to screen most of those out, but there was some in there. And that is it for me. And I'm going to turn it back over to Gary. And at the end, if you have any questions about this, we'll be happy to take them. All right, thanks.
So let's just like to talk about real quick in regards to alternative deliveries and some of the key takeaway, key factors that we have had experience with these. And the first one, let's talk about the design build here. I'm not going to read all these things, but obviously in regard to the design build, some of the things are applicable. We have found that we've had better success with let's say a more complex scope of work. Your run-of-the-mill scope of works is not really, unless you bundle things together in regarding to that thing. Design build is more fit for that. We'll have a more complex type of scope of work, and that's because like the third bullet there is it's where you're trying to draw out those innovative solutions, those ATCs, the unique approaches that we typically don't typically do with that. So that's one of the things we've learned from. And here again, I'm going to stress the right of way and utilities. You know, that they get. You've got to get that house cleaned up in regard to that, or sometimes that can create you some headaches. Next slide, Jen, please. The P3, the P3 method in regards to alternative delivery, you know, like for the RBR, it was great that we were able to get those bridges out the door without impacting our normal program recording. So that's sometimes that can be a very much benefit to out there, and it addresses your like I said before, that some of the bridges that we addressed, they weren't on our program for another 10 years. So we were able to get those out there and you know, out the door and meet some certain things in regard to that. And obviously, you know, it's the paying of it, you know, you can push that off. It's almost like a, you know, availability payment, mortgage type of a payment for that. And, you know, it can relieve you of some of your obligations that you have during your normal program and regarding your maintenance or things like that, you know, if sometimes you're kind of stretched that way, it can help you in those manners. Next slide, please. So some of the overall that are applicable for just alternative delivery. Number one thing that I like to stress is it's a proper risk allocation. I mean, you've got to understand who is best fit to get what you're trying to ask them to do, and in the most efficient manner. Implementing a time management early on in regard to that thing is, next two things is early on discussion. Just kind of, that seems to be the very much key in regard to a lot of things. Getting your house in order before you used to start jumping into things. And I said it before, everybody wants to jump into it, but try to resist that. Get things worked out. Establish your rules and engagements between you and all the parties. And we found that really does really help you out in the long run. And next one, please. And the last one, the slide is like I said, have your comprehensive operational plan up front, and that includes a lot of things. You're gonna need to have a dispute resolution process. It's just something that it's not a bad thing. You work it out. These are the means that you're gonna work things out, and you're gonna let people keep on focusing on what they really need. One things we learned from the RBR project is if you have a widespread out across let's say different type of, in our case it was engineering districts. We have 11 different engineering districts, so you have to really watch against that, especially in the design build or alternative delivery. That, hey, that's not the just because it's not the normal way of doing things doesn't mean it's a bad thing. You just got to be very cognizant of it, be cautious of it, and try to reduce them as much as you can. And the last thing that we've learned is, as Mark was talking about, is the coordination with your stakeholders, other agencies, extremely important. Get them on board. Get them on board quickly, and 99% of the time they're going to be a very supportive partner with you of your project, because there's a lot it attracts the things that everyone's trying to do here. But you just got to get them engaged. Get them engaged early, and have them understand the process, and develop those relationships, and that will really help you out with your project. I think that's our last slide, and I'm gonna, Mr. Jen, turn it over to you. Here's our contact information if you need it. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary, and thanks, Mark. Appreciate you taking the time today and giving us that presentation. And as a reminder, yes, please continue to ask your questions in the chat, and we will be sure to get those answered when we do the Q&A portion here at the end. So with that, I will turn it over to Peter from Minnesota DOT, and I think, Jen, you also have his slides.
So, afternoon, everyone. I am Peter Davich. I work with the Minnesota Department of Transportation. You see the slides are loading there. I have a similar presentation. I don't have nearly as big of a bundle or a large project as the case study that got used for this effort. My presentation mostly goes towards a few best practices that we use for NEPA in Minnesota, and then kind of demonstrating how we might use the design build tool to solve some environmental type problems, as opposed to CMGC or some other tools that might fit in different sorts of situations. So with that, looks like it's coming up here. If you can go to the next slide, I think I have the first bullets going. So just a brief introduction of how we work at MnDOT. We've been doing what I'll call alternative delivery for about 25 years. We had design build, some experimental ones back in the 90s. Really the first modern one occurred in 2002 in Minnesota. And we've been doing them relatively steadily since then, usually between 0 and 5 per year. Never too many, but rarely none. CMGC we added to our toolbox back in 2013, and we've been using that kind of commonly the past few years as well. The past few years, I'd say, I've been doing about as many CMGCs as design build, although in the long run, probably a couple more on the design build side. As you kind of see down at the bottom there, though, we're comfortable doing them at all sizes, at least all Minnesota sizes. We only get up to the $200 or $300 million project as opposed to some other states here. We're also very comfortable doing them at small project sizes. As you can see, we had one down in the $500,000 range. That would be rare, but if the scope is right for it, we're comfortable with design build down there as well. CMGC, again, all sizes, depending on the scope, making sure it's the right one. Next slide, please. As far as how we're arranged to do this, we are a decentralized state for design build. There's a few of us who have central positions who kind of support the districts in running these. I am, again, the design build program manager. Kevin Hagnes is our CMGC program manager. And we do have a design build oversight engineer who we try to assist with the projects following letting, although that position is open right now. We have some others who do, it's Kevin Kosabud. He helps with construction kind of innovation, regardless of delivery method. And Tony Lesh is specific to bridge for design build. As far as this meeting and workshop here goes, we do not have anybody specializing in design build environmental. So as far as that goes, we use our central environmental staff, and I go in and assist with the design build specific aspects of that. Beyond that, I don't have a large office or staff. What we do have is a general engineering consultant who supports me and the districts per project. I tend to help determine which method we use to deliver the projects. I kind of help them make strategic choices on the projects. I'm the project controls gatekeeper. I kind of make sure the verification is keeping everyone honest in regards to what the contract actually says, and help with some training. Our general consultants helps actually writing the RFP, kind of doing the horsepower there. They add some thoughts and expertise from other states, and they really kind of fill out all the extra again, horsepower that we would need to deliver design build projects. Next slide, please. And just as one more wrap up on what we are in Minnesota, we use both best value and low bid projects. Best value is definitely the highest use of design build. Hopefully when you're using the process, you're kind of looking for something more than just low cost. You're trying to use the contractor's expertise to solve some extra problems. But maybe you aren't. Maybe you're just trying to get the project out the door quickly. So a little bit is appropriate in some simple, perhaps simple acceleration sort of situations, where best value is needed when you have more complex problems to be dealt with. But when we do score, the technical score is usually given about 20 to 40% as much weight as the cost. So we're still heavier on cost and technical score. We put enough on there to make sure that the teams know we're serious and to put real thought into giving us different approaches to problems. We got the little graph there at the bottom. I keep that one around mostly because I liked how the percentages worked out. I did this. For the small projects, we were using low bid about half the time and best value about half the time. But if we get large and presumably complicated as well, we're using best value 100% of the time. Next slide, please. To get to the NEPA part of this. This is kind of some lessons learned from my position and previous positions just over time through several projects. I should have said I've been the program manager at MnDOT for about 9 years now, and I've worked on half or more of the design build projects that we've probably done in Minnesota. So some of these we sound familiar to Pennsylvania's experience, but I'll kind of go through here. One of the things we realized early on is try to keep the NEPA process as similar as possible to bid build. We do try to complete more or less the process per bid build processes before going out to design build, and to keep the contractor out of NEPA as much as possible. We want to make sure we are being as appropriate as we would in bid build. We want to make sure that cost focus is not causing the contractor to make different choices in the NEPA process. So as far as we've gone in Minnesota, we have completed the environmental documentation before advertising an RFP almost every time. There have been a couple specific cases where we haven't, but frankly, we've just been waiting for a final signature, and we got approval from the FHWA to move forward with a final signature pending. With that said, the things you do different during the documentation would be to talk much more about performance than specifics. We do usually complete a layout as usual to go along with our NEPA documentation, of course. But my role in staying active with that would be to remind everybody, we have the layout, but we're not telling the contractor to build this exactly as the picture looks. We're committing to performance as opposed to specifics. We don't want to tell the contractor build exactly these 4 ponds that we're showing on the layout. We want to tell the contractor meet permit requirements. So in our basic configuration, we will not say, construct the ponds as shown. We will say, meet the permit requirements. And in our conversations for the project, we will tell them, yes, as usual, our layout shows one possible solution, but unless we tell you to do it, you can do this a different way if you think it's more efficient or better in regard to our scoring criteria. Same thing with even something like an interchange. We have a conversation with the stakeholders and those writing up the NEPA documentation as they are in place. Sometimes it's very important to construct one particular type of interchange, in which case we'll specify it. Sometimes it's not, and we think that one functions slightly better, but we would be open to others. So in those cases, we write the documentation to be specific to the amount of access provided, and not necessarily a specific interchange type. We try to clear the corridors such the design build teams can use the right of way. That's easier said than done, but we try to write the documentation to say, look, if the roadway shifted 10 feet this way or that way, that's not going to change what we're committing to in our NEPA documentation. I know South Carolina has done some interesting work with that. We've been kind of looking at how they do it. But in our case, we try to have the conversations with those, if nothing else, the local partners in the FHWA to say, just remember, this is a design build project. This road might move 20 feet that way. This pond might change from one side to the other, just so that those factors are clear in everybody's head as we move through. Sometimes they'll come back and say, no, I'm very concerned. I don't want the pond over there, or there is a wetland over there we can't impact. In those cases, we will add contract wording to say, look, you can move things around, but not specifically here and not specifically there because of specific impacts. Noise commitments have been a challenge for us in regards to NEPA in Minnesota. The way we have done it is we have done our noise documentation similar to how we would in bid build, which basically comes through and does a noise analysis and says, here are the final noise impacts that the residents and particular receptors will see along the corridor following the project. And then the contract follows up and says, hey, contractor, here are the noise commitments that NEPA has committed the project to. You can't raise any of these on any particular receptor. So you would imagine that pretty much anywhere that the profile would want to be raised and somewhere anywhere near a receptor, there would be issues with that. And that you might go up by whether it's 1/10 of a decibel or 1 decibel or how much is too much. We've had a long conversation about that. We've kind of come to a consensus that if you're within 0.3 decibels of what it says, that's kind of a de minimis change. Anything larger than that, we do kind of need to redo it through a noise revisitation process that has been done several times for profile changes that we view as overall beneficial. But that has been a challenge that we've used in Minnesota. And scoring criteria, they are useful for reducing impacts. That gets to the case study I put together for this effort. When deciding between design build and CMGC in Minnesota, we use CMGC if we have lots of third-party or environmental risks that we need to keep control of. There are some very interested local partners. If there are some impacts we're very concerned about, if we're very concerned about maintenance in an area and how something would work in the long run, we kind of shift towards CMGC and say, look, we need to keep control of this stuff because we can't impact our local partners or break a relationship with our permitting agencies, what have you.
Are you in the car yet?
Maybe sounds like somebody came off mute there, but if on the other hand, we are looking to solve a problem, often roadway problems, of course, for roadway agencies, but sometimes environmental problems, design build can be very powerful in saying, look, here is a category of problem we are looking to solve. We want to either reduce impacts to locals, perhaps reduce wetland impacts, or we want to get the noise barriers up as early as possible on a project, or we want the contractor to put together a good communication plan with the locals so they can hear, from somebody who controls the construction schedule when things will be happening, or just a more broad environmental approach. We have got some good value from contractors in regards to those environmental issues that are things that we mentioned in NEPA documentation to say, by using the design build approach, our experience has taught us that we might be able to reduce these wetland impacts further by scoring it, or we might be able to avoid more contamination by scoring a reduction in impact of contamination in the scoring criteria for the project. Next slide, please. Here's a few project examples. So I'll go through a few here and then I kind of finish with the case study. One project that we had was, and I should say all of these were lessons learned. They mostly relate to, did we need a reevaluation of the NEPA that we had done once we ran into an issue following letting? In most cases, we have found that the changes we've made in the design build did not rise to the level of reevaluation. Sometimes we've talked about it and it's been borderline. There have been a couple of rare cases where we've had to, but that's usually something we very much keep in mind as writing NEPA in the first place. And then, certainly try to avoid if possible following letting, but you have to when you have to. The first example on here is a major river crossing. It was I-35 over the Minnesota River, of course, in the south side of the Twin Cities. The roadway line changed 50 feet as we were going up the bluff on one side of the river. As you might think, you're having different impacts on a bluff above a river. That's kind of screams, hey, look, you're changing different things. This might be a reevaluation needed. As we kind of worked through it with those involved with NEPA and the FHWA, say that the entire shift was contained within the right of way. Obviously, there were different impacts, but to some extent, it was just different trees. They were on the east side of the road as opposed to the west side of the road. The functionality of the road didn't change. No different, wetlands were impacted. In the long case, we took a look at it and said, is a reevaluation really needed here? We read the text in NEPA and said, this is categorically the same situation as discussed. And because of that, we think no, even though it changed by 50 feet based on a contractor's different concept. On the same project, a pedestrian trail moved from the east side of the river, east side of the bridge crossing the river to the west side. Depending on how major that change might be compared to the infrastructure on either side, we thought maybe that could be a reevaluation. In this case, there was minimal infrastructure on either side of the bridge. It was mostly tying into a long trail system that ran along the river and then kind of quite a ways up the bluff before it kind of tied into local development and things like that. We said, even though this feels different in some ways, and it is different than the picture shown on the document, we think a reevaluation is not needed for that one in particular. It's functionally doing the same thing, even though it changed sides. One that had been different for us, we were doing an interstate reconstruction. We received an ATC that said, hey, we'd like to, instead of widening the interstate to the outside, to the inside, we'd like to widen it to the outside. Easier for construction, easier for drainage on the inside to have the open ditch once again. Hey, MnDOT, can we do this via ATC? Very long story short, we looked into the development on that and the ATC was approved. However, the conversation and the communication was probably not as good as it could have been. There were some conversations earlier in the development of that ATC where that exact situation had been studied in the process and ruled out. In that case, we did have to go back and do a reevaluation on the process. It was rather messy. And long story short, again, it reinforced our desire to complete NEPA prior to letting on design build projects and not to allow contractors to reopen it. And many of them are not expert in the process, and it just introduces new variables that are difficult to deal with following letting, with schedules bearing down on everyone. So lesson learned, once again, try not to allow that to be opened unless there's an excellent idea that both clearly improves the environmental impacts and benefits the project more broadly. Finally, the last mini case example, we had a 610 project. The contractor took a look at it and said, hey, we see your preliminary noise study and we see the receptors here. Look, you're committing to noise values at these receptors of this level, but because we lowered the profile, we can actually lower the noise wall height along the corridor and still meet those same impact values at those receptors. So that was just something they were planning on doing as part of the post-project administration. And we looked at it and said, no, everywhere you construct a noise wall in Minnesota, it's 20 feet high. You don't change it to reduce it if you think you can, simply because you can meet the values in NEPA. You're not going to have a noise wall that just wanders up and down randomly looking for the public just because of the those values. So lesson learned there. I need to say that's not only do you simply need to meet the noise receptor values specified in NEPA, we have to have a logical looking noise wall as well, which is something we would have thought went without saying, but you never know what might pop into a contractor's mind with some cost incentives. Next slide, please. The case study that came together for this project, will be steered in the end, is the Crookston project, which is probably my favorite project that I've worked on in MnDOT. This one was not environmentally interesting because NEPA was highly difficult. Actually, in this case, we have a small area of the city of Crookston in northern Minnesota. It's right next to the river. And as you can sort of see in the picture there was a large failure in this area that caused several of the houses that used to be there to be destroyed. And it kind of continued to bite away over the years and was starting to get close to our highway. Because the houses were out of the way and it was not really an official park, there was not anything here to be technically impacted on a environmental level. So the NEPA documentation was not very substantial. However, it was an environmental problem that we had to solve that was somewhat outside of our regular expertise as roadway designers in MnDOT. So we thought of delivering this a few different ways. We could do it in design bid build, but we aren't necessarily experts at solving failures that's, in this case, extended 90 feet below the ground. We had some ideas, but weren't really sure what contractors might be able to do that would be more efficient than that. We thought about using CMGC to once again control the design, but in this case, if you're only selecting one contractor to work with from the beginning, you're going to be kind of tied to their expertise and not necessarily be able to consider other types of solutions, or at least they'll be likely to encourage particular types of solutions based on what they typically do. So again, the high level factors, there were historic slides in 1934 and 2008. And what was actually going on here was that when the river, in drought conditions, when the river got low, there was less water in that river. And because there was less water, there was less weight sitting on the bottom of the slope. And because there was less weight on the bottom of the slope, it would tend to slide toward the river. And that failure plane was a big circular failure through the clay that went, again, roughly 90 feet deep down in the ground. We selected design build because it offered the design competition, because there were not a lot of local conditions to be dealt with in partners. The people who lived there had been bought out, and it was mostly the open green space leading up to our highway. We said, let's let a few contractors give us ideas here and see what they can do. So as we flip through the next few slides, we can see the four proposals we got for this. The first contractor gave us this proposal. They said, you know what we'll do? You've got a big failing slope. All you need to do is, maybe you can see it there, pound one row of piling up on top of the slope to keep things from moving, and then pound a double row of piling down near the bottom to keep the slope from failing down at the bottom. And with those 700 piling toothpicks in the ground, that'll keep your slope from moving. This is the best way to do it, MnDOT. Next slide, please. Another one came to us and said, no, that's not how you solve it. What you do is, because this is a big circular failure where at the bottom it's kind of pushing out into the river, you put some anchor blocks down near the bottom. Those are the kind of red squares you see near the bottom of the slope on this graphic. And with those the anchors down at the bottom, you then shoot a cable from that 100 feet down into the ground until you hit the bedrock. And with those anchors cabled and attached down to the bedrock, if the bottom of the slope can't move outward, your slope can't go anywhere, and it'll be holding it in place. You might have to change the tension on those from time to time, depending on what's going on. So it's sort of an active solution, but hey, MnDOT, this is the best way to solve it. Next slide, please. The third contractor said yet again, nope, there's another way to do this. What you really want to do is go in and do some soil mixing. So in every one of those kind of rectangular areas you see there along the slope, you go in, you get a machine that digs down deep, pulls up a lot of material, mixes it with concrete, and pushes it back down in the ground. And in the end, you have basically concrete pillars of sort of cemented soil every, I believe it was 50 feet or so across that failure plane. And once those are there, it kind of prevents anything from moving. And once again, you've got it anchored in place. Next slide. So the first three solutions were all things we had sort of considered about when doing this internally. The fourth team came back and gave us something that we hadn't frankly thought of before. They said, no, you don't need to do any of that. What we would do is we actually have a huge excavator that has a 100-foot boom on it. All you really need to do is sit up at the top of the slope, use this excavator with a huge boom to reach down about 100 feet and pull up, some kind of slice through the soil and pull up these kind of shear walls. So they took the soil out along those slices you see. They held it open, the cut open with some grout, but they put the soil back in and basically similar to the soil mixing, they put kind of these shear walls in place that actually extended from the top of the slope most of the way down. But then they also went, whatever it was, 80, 90 feet below ground because of the huge excavator that was available. And with these shear walls spaced every 50 or 100 feet, there was no longer enough space between them for the failure plane to develop. And they were anchored in place that way, in frankly, a way we had not considered using, because they had equipment that we did not know was available for this. And long story short, we looked at the four of these, and our geotech studied it with some experts and said, frankly, this fourth one looks like it would work, very well. And it's a kind of simple, elegant solution. We choose the fourth one. And as we moved through the process and got to the end, the bids came in. I believe the engineer's estimate was something around 7.4 million. The solution came in at 6.4 million. It was the second highest technical score, but we thought it was a very good solution. They won the project and constructed it this way. I believe it was a very interesting and elegant solution to a problem that in a way that we had not considered using before. It was outside our expertise and kind of showed the power of design build by getting multiple proposals to solve an environmental issue. And next slide, I think that was the end, except for I have one slide in here in case these are put out. This is a link to our design build website that shows our manual, and a link to kind of our project pages to show some past information from MnDOT. With that though, it's 2 o'clock and I should be done. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Peter. Appreciate your time. So our last state that we're going to hear from today is Utah DOT, and we have Phil Ellsworth and Brandon Weston. So I will turn it over to Phil, and I think Jen has your slides as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So while she's getting that pulled up, let me just introduce myself. So I'm Phil Ellsworth. I'm actually a consultant with Elevated Consulting Group, and I've had the privilege of being an integrated team member with the UDOT Alternative Delivery Division for the last 14 years. And the reason you get to hear from me today is because the department's alternative delivery engineer recently retired about 8 days ago, hung up his hat, and is moving into the next phase of his life. And so here I am today trying to fill in those big shoes. So hopefully we can get you some good information today. So just to give you an overview of the alternative delivery program at UDOT, UDOT has been utilizing alternative delivery methods since about 1997, when a few years before the Olympics came to town, it was determined that some significant infrastructure upgrades needed to occur, and that this was going to be a project of such magnitude that the department had never done anything like this. And it was determined that design build really was the best method to accomplish that. And other than tweaks along the way and lessons learned, the department really hasn't looked back since and has just been adding to their repertoire in terms of alternative delivery methods available to them. So like I said, so since 1997, the department has engaged in about 58 different projects totaling about $7.2 billion for design build. For CMGC, they've been utilizing this method since about 2006, have done about 41 projects totaling $1.4 billion in total project funds. And then finally, a new one being added to the toolbox here is the progressive design build method. This has been utilized just since 2019. There's one project ongoing and hopefully coming to a conclusion soon towards the end of this year. And then there's one progressive design build just beginning as well that they have just selected a progressive design builder on that one and just getting rolling on that one. So the bottom line here is, for a state of our size, this alternative delivery program represents a very significant portion of the project dollars that the department manages for the state. And depending on the year, it can represent a very significant chunk of the total project budget, certainly over 50% for most years, at least within the last 10 years. Okay, go ahead and go to the next slide. Excellent. So you're going to hear a lot of familiar themes, I think, from our presentation, as along with the Pennsylvania presentation and Minnesota as well. Which is kind of nice because it sounds like everybody's learning some of those similar things, and that everybody who's coming into this mix can benefit from a lot of that. So in terms of the alternative delivery program at UDOT, there's a variety of factors that play into the reason why the department utilizes alternative delivery. And really, the first and foremost is just allows so much flexibility to manage projects just based upon their unique challenges. Every project is different and has a different risk profile and different other different factors that need to be brought to the table. And so having a variety of tools in your toolbox can be really beneficial in helping to deliver a program. Each delivery method also contributes to the department's knowledge, both in terms of institutional knowledge and also just individual knowledge. In terms of the engineering and construction solutions that are utilized. There's quite a few different things that the department has experienced through alternative delivery that they wouldn't have otherwise. From best value to early work packages to various design solutions like DDIs, CFIs, flex lanes, movable barrier, reversible lanes, even emergency landslide solutions that have come into play as well as experience in helping to understand the benefits of ABC methodologies and other structural elements and so on. So it has definitely added to the department's experience. And then each delivery method also has its own set of tools to help the department manage project and program risk. And, this really plays into the decision a lot of times as to whether or not to engage an alternative delivery method. And that is, what does the risk look like on this project, and how does this delivery method benefit the management of that particular project or those risks? Okay, go ahead and move on to the next one. So in the case study that was written up associated with this presentation today, the methodology utilized to determine design build as the selected method for that project, which is the I-15 Tech Corridor project, really boils down to 4 main points. And these tend to kind of surface a lot in determining whether something goes design build. So the first one being complexity. For large complex projects, design build tends to be a utilized tool a lot because a design builder can bring to the table a variety of resources that the department simply doesn't have access to otherwise. So complexity is a big factor in deciding to go design build. Another element is innovation. And you heard this in some of the other presentations as well. When you're looking for unique ideas to unique challenges, design build can really bring a lot to the table in terms of getting a lot more eyeballs on the problem, looking for solutions. And this comes through both the process during procurement when you're sitting down and engaging these design builders one-on-one before they bid the project, but it also extends into the contract administration portion when you can really collaborate and find solutions to smaller problems as well. Sometimes it's not always about the big wow factor innovations that people really look at. Sometimes the benefits come through very small optimizations in the process and in the engineering and in the construction methodologies, little things that really add up to a lot in the big picture, especially with some of those larger complex projects. Another item here is schedule. Schedule is a unique one because right now the department this is a secondary factor for the department in determining whether to go to design build or not. It used to be a primary factor, but over the years we've discovered that really if you're setting up your design build right for positive outcomes in terms of quality and meeting contract, requirements, you end up with a schedule that can often look a lot like what a design bid build project would. But because over the years, we've tended to squeeze our procurement process, timelines for design build, as well as squeeze the construction and design schedules. And we've found that that's not always beneficial in terms of the outcome on quality. So in a way, we're trying to put the genie back in the bottle and say, schedule really shouldn't be the driving factor in making a decision as to whether to go to design build or not, but it can be a factor as long as some of these other things make sense as well. The fourth item is risk, and we've talked about that already. But risk management profiles when it comes to alternative delivery, those methods can be really beneficial in helping to allocate risk properly. One thing to keep in mind with risk is that with design build in particular, traditionally risk has quite often been heavily pushed towards the design builder. And what we're finding is that that's not always the most appropriate way to allocate risk, because first of all, you're going to just drive up your bids because when you push risk to the design builder, it doesn't just go away. They're going to just bid that risk, and that can oftentimes lead to increased bids and costs for the project. But the other thing that we've discovered over the years is that design builders are starting to say, we're not willing to take the risk profile on that you're putting out for this project. And so some design builders we've seen, hey, step away from even bidding, which reduces competition, which also has a factor on costs as well. And so really the design builder is trying to take a more strategic approach to risk and allocating that risk a little bit more precisely or accurately when it comes down to things. An example of this would be, for instance, differing site conditions. For a long time in UDOT, the risk profile for differing site conditions definitely we're putting the risk entirely on the design builder. But over the years, we've started to step back from that and say, really, is this appropriate when differing site conditions are something that really is out of the control of both the design builder and the department? So we've started to move towards a risk profile on differing site conditions, which reflect more of what our standard terms and conditions would outline for a design bid build. So, and another thing on risk in terms of being more strategic in how to allocate risk is utilizing a different methodology, like, for instance, this progressive design build model, where you can get the benefits of design build, but you can be more strategic in your risk allocation upfront during the design portion of the project. Okay, next slide. So just some things to talk about in terms of lessons learned, and these are more detailed in the case study that was written up for this, but let me just touch on these briefly, and then I'll turn the time over to Brandon Weston, who's going to get into the NEPA aspects of our presentation today. So with regards to design build lessons learned, some things to take away here. You know, there's oftentimes a learning curve for DOT staff on these projects. And it's not even just the case at the beginning of a whole program. You know, I mean, this is a constant learning curve, because design bid build is still a project methodology or delivery method that is utilized quite significantly, and that most of the DOT staff have the most experience with. So depending on where you got your alternative delivery project and how it's structured in terms of which regions getting it and which districts and other staff that have been serving on those projects, you can quite often come up with new, you have a situation where new staff comes up and is not experienced in design build or other alternative delivery methods. So it's important to have a good training program set up so that you can bring people up to speed. Because design build, you have to think so differently from design bid build, because you know, you're really turning things over to the design builder, or that's the intent, is to turn things over to the design builder and then simply manage them from a perspective of making sure that they are meeting your standard terms and, you know, your standard specifications and other guidelines and other RFP requirements, and trying to step back and not controlling things from a preferential standpoint quite as much. So that can be quite a bit of a learning curve. And so having a program set up to help everybody get on board with that is important. Another element here is with regards to touching on risk one more time here. Risk is important. You really got to be strategic in how you allocate risk. It can't just be a one size fits all, or just throw the dead cat over the fence. You really got to take a look at risk and allocate it where it's appropriate for a number of reasons. You know, one of those being making sure that you've got an industry out there that is continuing to pursue these projects, to have a competitive environment, but also to avoid just having risk simply bid and the department paying for risk where it may not be necessary. Another lesson learned is with stipends. With regards to this particular item, you have to look at stipends as opposed to being an expense on the project. It's really an investment, because you're investing in the outcome of the discussions that lead to the innovations and other ideas that you're getting out of the design build process. And then finally, and this is a theme that you saw maybe in a couple of the other presentations as well, and that is utilizing performance-based requirements where possible. This may not be something you can do with every particular component of your project, but you really need to take a hard look and say, where can we be more performance-based to give flexibility where possible to the design builder, so that we're not squeezing them in terms of their ability to utilize the design build and extract the benefits of the design build methodology and process. So finally, just one other thing to mention here in terms of design build and risk, CFR allows DOTs to select design builders all the way up and, or to select a design builder prior to an environmental document actually being in place. But one of the ways that we have felt like helping to manage risk when it comes to that environmental process is to not even advertise the RFP until we have the environmental in place, and then just allowing the design builder to do environmental re-evals where necessary to accommodate their design. And this has been something that's been helpful in terms of us managing the environmental risk. I'm going to turn the time over to Brandon now to kind of get a little bit more into detail on that NEPA side of things.
There we go. Can somebody let me know if you can hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I wanted to thank Phil for jumping in at the last minute to help us out, help us fill the void, and also recognize Matt Zundel, our, alternative delivery engineer who'd been working with us for quite a while, and I hope he enjoys his retirement. I also think that days like this and recently we haven't been enjoying his retirement here internally all that much. I try to keep it a little high level to stick with what we had to work with. You'll find a little bit more detail in the case study that they're going to post online, so I encourage you to read that. Wanted to highlight some differences between Utah and a lot of other states in the country with that Utah is a NEPA assignment state, which can seem like it may make something different in terms of design build or CMGC or some of those different alternative delivery concepts, but it really hasn't. The laws are the same. All the regulations still apply. What we do have is a little flexibility to make those decisions a little quicker as a department with the NEPA authority delegated from FHWA. So it does have that benefit. But in terms of difference between a NEPA document for a design build versus a design bid build, I would hope that you wouldn't find a difference whatsoever in terms of the way it's put together, how it looks, how it analyzes resources, et cetera. In Utah, we typically use our design build projects for larger, more complex projects, things that need to get out the door quickly and be opened quickly. We have had a lot of success doing that, meeting those goals with it. There are projects that generally, like I said, are more complex, big projects, and they warrant a more robust NEPA analysis. So most likely, if we put out a design build project, it's been evaluated with an EA or an EIS versus like a CADX, assuming it's federally funded. Again, it's I'd like to reiterate. First of all, I'd like to try to say that word again. I'd like to reiterate what Phil said in that I just completely lost my thought. Good job, Phil. I'll move on. Mitigation commitments that have come out of those environmental documents are incorporated into the RFP. Next slide, please. So I also wanted to talk about ATCs, alternative technical concepts, which have been, somewhat of a challenge to us at the department as they come in, because we do these EISs, we do the EAs, we secure 404 permits a lot of times before it goes out in RFP to look for that innovation and look for those changes that we're really looking for. And so when from an environmental perspective, when we take a look at those ATCs, we look at what likely changes to the environmental process would occur with that change. Is it a NEPA issue? Do we need to think about doing a reevaluation? Are there other issues associated with that in terms of changes to 404 permits and other permits? And what we try to do is keep those as much as we can as the responsibility of the design builder, not get in the way of the design builder being able to make schedule with a ATC that we've approved, essentially from an engineering perspective, not necessarily environmental. The process and the coordination on how to approach those changes when they come out after the RFP is spelled out in the RFP with regard to the specifics of that project, whether it is, like I said, a 404 permit or otherwise. The authority in the review for any NEPA compliance that takes place after the award to the design builder, we again try to keep as much risk as possible on the design builder, which I think is a benefit to them as well, because they have more control. They have the details of exactly where that fits in their schedule and how they can manage that risk a little bit better. The authority and the review, however, stays with UDOT. So even though the design builder could have a consultant working for them, preparing a NEPA document, it, in this case, most likely a reevaluation, it will still have to adhere to our manuals and our requirements, and then be submitted to UDOT for review and approval. So there is not always 100% of the risk being assigned to the design builder on that, but we do approach it as a partnering, a partnering relationship, in that we are successful if they're successful. So we do try to keep those reviews on task and on target and keep things going. And obviously, if we've gotten this far with an ATC that we are completing a NEPA compliance document, we have already accepted that we would like that ATC to occur. So we're on board. I wanted to just mention that not all ATCs are accepted. I've seen some come through in years past of we just weren't okay with the additional environmental impacts that it would incur. Maybe it violated an agreement we had with certain cities or even NGOs in the NEPA process, that we just weren't willing to go back and revisit those issues that have been taken care of. And that leads into just general unacceptable risk, whether it's to schedule or even litigation risk. We try to keep as much as possible consistent with our original NEPA document, but understanding that we go out to a design builder, for example, to look for that innovation, to look for those ideas that didn't come up in the environmental process. And sometimes that's because maybe there was a lack of technical expertise on the team, but more than likely, it is the degree of design that we are working with at that time. And so we need to keep that open to those ideas and be flexible within our own process and ideas to allow those things so we can realize the benefits from the innovation that they bring. We could have gotten into more details and give you some horror stories there. I think it might be better to take care of in the chat and save as much time for questions as possible. So with that, Jen, I think the last one is a wrap up to remind you we're with UDOT. There you go. And that's all I have. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Brandon, and thanks everyone. So we'll have the questions now. I know that there's been some chatter in the chat, so we won't go into those that have been already asked and answered, but we can start. I think we have a couple of questions that were posed in the chat for Gary and Mark. So one of the first questions is, can you quantify the claims and directed orders, the percentage over initial DB price?
Sure, I can take a crack at that. Let me think about this. It ended up being somewhere between, I would say, about 2 or 3% of the overall bid initial DB price, which is very, very typical for, I'd say, our normal program. Some runs around 3.5%. So we saw a little bit of a decline in regard to that. Because of that, but the majority of those change orders were, like I said, a directed order, which we made a decision going into the game that we would have to pay extra for. It actually came down to one of those risk decisions that you come about is, do you pay, for example, the utility relocations? We had a discussion with the development entity, and they said, we have no idea how to price this. And we price it in, we're going to have to put a very large number in there. So we said, all right, fine. Why don't we just pay for the actual price of the relocations? And that's what we did. And that sort of worked out a little bit better as opposed to getting an escalated price during the bid phase.
All right, thanks. Another question for Gary and Mark. Did you establish a key contact from the DE or the NEPA consultant that was allowed to coordinate directly with the agencies on behalf of DOT?
Well, we established a let's say key personnel list that was allowed to coordinate with the agencies, and those were the people who were only allowed to coordinate with them, and we work with them, introduce them to the outside agencies, and so it wasn't that anybody could go and call our partners and our agencies, environmental protection agencies or things like that. It was just yes, we had a list of people who could.
Great. Another one for Gary and Mark. Was 106 determination of effect and consultation kept with the DOT?
Yes, it was.
Right. Another one for you all. How did you handle wetland permitting? That process takes a significant amount of time and effort in New Hampshire. Were you allowed to streamline / group permits or permit each individual bridge?
Yes, each individual bridge had to be a permit, but outside of a handful of bridges in which we got the permits, the development entity was responsible for getting the permits for the majority of them. Now, with that being said, as Mark explained, because we have relationships with the agencies, and this is what we do every day for a living, we had to do a little bit of hand-holding in regard to that to get them up to snuff. Of course, they did use our typical consulting firms that we would use to do such a thing, but whenever things get have to work through a lot like that, they did rely on our relationship with the agencies to help them through this.
Great. Another one for you all. Where can we find examples of Section 40F, the Section 40F template, and streamlined Section 106 determination of effect document?
We're going to have to send that out. So if you can get some contact information, we can send them out to them.
Perfect. And we can follow up with you, Gary, and get that out to this group.
Okay, great.
And then another one, did you use a dispute resolution panel to solve any disputes?
Yes, we did. And actually, we only ended up taking a couple of disputes to the dispute resolution panel. And those disputes, first of all, we didn't go to the formal panel. We went for an informal panel to get their interpretation of things. We got their interpretation, and then we ended up working it out with the development entity for that. I can't stress that enough. Of one of the keys to success of a project in regard to that is a determined person who says, we're going to work through these things. We're going to sit here and at the end of the table, and we're going to work through them. And eventually you can get through them. You really can. Sometimes it's very painful. But at the end of the day, we did have a dispute resolution panel. We should have kept them. We should have kept them engaged earlier on in the project, as opposed to when we really needed. So if you're going to use a panel, I would suggest from day one, keep them abreast of the project, the process of the progress of the process, so they don't have that tremendous learning curve whenever you do have to bring a dispute for their determination.
Great, thank you. Another one, can you describe in general terms the financing package assembled for the bridge replacement P3?
Sure, this was an availability payment type of project. So as the development entity brought or replaced each of the bridges, they got paid for that bridge. So the bridges rolled on. So as we thought it was going to be an incentive to get them to get these all the bridges replaced as quickly as possible, because they weren't getting paid until they replaced them. So as let's just say 1 month they did 10 bridges, they got paid for 10 bridges. Next month, they did another bridges, and then they got paid for 20 bridges. And that continued to grow until they got all 558 bridges replaced. And that will, at the end of the term, they'll roll off that way too, where they'll slowly weed down in regards to the payments, and to eventually they're, all the bridges are for the 25-year term.
Great. And this next question is for Mark, and I know he's still on. So Mark, if you can unmute yourself, go ahead. But it also, I think maybe James might be able to chime in as well. The question is, do you know if Federal Highways is considering changes to 23 CFR 636.109 based on PennDOT's experience with the Step 15 process? Let's see if we can.
Well, the only thing I can say in regard to that is I know that we sent our recommendation down to FHWA. So if someone from FHWA can extrapolate on that, but we sent our recommendations down, and we're waiting for a response from FHWA.
All right. Well, I'm not sure if Mark can unmute his line, but we can follow up with Federal Highways and get an answer for y'all. And then the next question is for all of the panelists. It's and I think there's been some exchange in the chat about this. I know Peter from MnDOT answered the question as well, but the new guidance for use of the NEVI funding, the EV funding, requires all NEPA review and other environmental work be done prior to the obligation of funds, and the project must be delivered within 6 months. Yes. Can any of the presenters speak to how your agency is preparing for that? So I know Minnesota did answer in the chat, but I wasn't sure if Pennsylvania or Utah. Any thoughts on how you're considering addressing the NEVI funding requirements?
All I can say, this is Phil here, is that the department is still trying to understand their own options on this. I think they're trying to get some more information before they make a decision. So I don't think that we have much to offer in terms of that question.
Yeah, I think many of the states are still
in the same boat.
Yeah, I think you're not alone. Lots of people in that boat. All right, so I think some of these other questions, given based on the time that they came in, are for it's maybe for everyone, but how do you manage contamination encountered during construction, and does Federal Highway participate in cleanup costs? It looks like that one might be for anyone who wants to answer. I know Minnesota again did answer in the chat, but Utah, Pennsylvania, not sure if you have anything to add.
Say this is Peter from Minnesota. I did answer in the chat, but for anybody who didn't see that, what we typically do is we go through our normal contamination studies, the phase 1, the phase 2s in pre-design, as we normally would for a bid build project. And then once we get around to letting the project, we define the areas where we found contamination as known contamination and other areas as unknown. And the contract basically says if you find contamination in areas where we knew there was contamination, you contractor are going to pay to take care of it. If you find it in areas where we didn't know there was any, we will hold the risk, so you don't have to bid unknown contamination risk. And MnDOT will issue a change order to deal with it. As for the FHWA side of it, I think we just pay for those using MnDOT change funds. I don't believe we usually use federal funds, but there might have been a case, I'm not quite sure. I should say, I find a map very helpful to do that. We try to describe those using the phase 1 or phase 2 documents, or certainly just using text. Issues arose. But if you have a very clear document that says, here's where MnDOT is taking the risk and here's where the contractor is taking the risk, that's very helpful. And you can actually expand the areas or to places where you didn't necessarily find any, but you say, look, we're not going to take the risk here. We think there's some contamination there, even though we don't have evidence of it. But the map shows you where you've been.
Thanks, Peter. Appreciate that. All right, so it looks like we've gotten through all of the questions in the chat, but I'll wait a second and see if anyone has any others to add while we're getting ready to wrap up. So I will just reiterate what I said at the beginning, that we do have case studies that will be posted soon to our the center's website, which is environment.transportation.org, related to the cases that you heard more about today. So please head over to our website in the coming weeks. Hopefully we'll have those up very soon, and encourage you to download those. This also was recorded, this webinar today, so we'll have that posted on the website as well. And in the meantime, I would thank all of our speakers today, not only for their time in preparing for today, but also working with us to get the case studies put together. And I also would like to thank James Gavin with Federal Highway and Neil Vanikar with Federal Highway as well for their help in putting this virtual peer exchange on and supporting us as we were working on the case studies. So with that, I guess we'll let everyone go for today, and thank everyone again for your time today, and we will talk to you soon, I'm sure.